In this video, we're going to take a look at logging in Spring Boot. We're going to take a deep dive look at something called a logback file, which is how we configure logging in Spring Boot. In a previous video, we covered an overview of logging. Now we're going to jump a little bit deeper. First of all, let me describe the difference between a logger and an appender. A logger is something that gathers logging information from our code. We'll typically start with something called a root logger, which is like the default logger where all of our logging comments go. Think of this just like a holding area. Now on top of that we have an appender. An appender actually takes this logging information from the holding area, and publishes it out somewhere that we specify. Could be a console, could be an output stream, could be a file, could be a rolling file. One of the things that we see most frequently is the rolling file, where essentially we will write to a log file, and then once either we hit a date or time boundary or a size boundary, we'll roll that logging file to a backup and start a new log file. So we'll take a look at some of this in this video and how we can accomplish this. Logging is much better than just doing a system out print line, because system out print line just goes to the standard output and doesn't have the concept of severity level. But severity level is really what's key to logging, because we can use that to filter log details and put certain severe errors in one place and then all other kind of logging information somewhere else. So, logger versus appender. In Spring Boot, we can configure our logging with one of these file names that I have listed here. Logback-spring, logback-xml, logback-spring.groovy, logback.groovy, so on and so forth. So what happens is Spring Boot looks for a file with this name on the class path, and if it finds it, it uses that to understand where the logging information is. There are several things that we're going to see in our logger file. One is we can set up properties, which is kind of like a name-value pair. And then the other thing is we can configure our appenders, as I mentioned earlier. Console appender, file appender, and one of the most common, the rolling file appender. So in this exercise, we're going to set up a couple of different rolling file appenders. One that catches all, and another with only severe, essentially warns and errors and greater. Now, when you look at a logging file, it can be very intimidating because there are a lot of symbols that we'll see. As a matter of fact, when we define a rolling file appender, we'll typically give it a file name. The file name must have a %d in it, and the %d represents a date or time. Once we get a log that goes beyond the boundary of this date or time, it will automatically create a new log file. In other words, we could have a \d and then a year and a month. That means that all of the logs for October will go into one log file, but then the first log in November will go into a new log file dedicated to November. You could do this based on year, month, week, day, even hour, minute, second, as you prefer. Day is usually pretty much a default boundary that we'll use for time. In addition to that, you could have a very verbose logging day where you end up logging a whole bunch of details. So an optional parameter that you can put in the file name is this %i. And that means that you'll get a new log file not just when you hit the date boundary, but also when you hit a time boundary. So in other words, October 18th, you could have one logging file, or you could say, okay, every time we hit 10 megabytes, roll over to a new file. If you have maybe 30 megabytes of logs on October 18th, then you'll have 3 different logging files, because you've hit that 10 megabyte boundary 3 different times. So you have to have the date indicator. You may have the I indicator. And the I indicator just represents an integer, which essentially says which log file is this for this specific day. Now in your file name, if you add a .gz or a .zip extension, it will automatically compress it, which is a good idea, because many times, especially with verbose logging, these log files can get very large. A few other parameters that we can set up in our logback file. Max history means how many historical files do we want to keep. Above and beyond that, they will automatically housekeep. Max file size is used when you have that %i symbol. It says once you go past this boundary of file size, let's go ahead and rename the previous file. And you'll see down below I have a bit more information with min index and max index as well, because it can be a little bit tricky. If our log file is named log.txt, as soon as we hit our max file size, it will back up and become log1.txt, and then everything new will be logged to log.txt. Once our new log.txt log.text hits its maximum file size, we take the old log1 text, rename it to log2 text. We take the current log text, rename it to log1 text, and then we start a new log.text. This keeps going, but we can't go beyond the max index. Once we go beyond the max index, it starts just deleting the oldest log file every time it creates a new log file. So this allows us to manage our disk space so that the logging file doesn't end up consuming all of our disk space and becoming a problem of its own. Now, within a log file, you can specify the format for the output. In other words, when I have a log statement, how is it going to be formatted? So this, if you're not familiar with these symbols, these can be a bit intimidating, but this is a quick dictionary of some of the more common symbols that we'll use when we're deciding our format. This applies to every line in the log file. So in other words, we're describing what you will see in a single line. %D, date of a logging event. %P, a priority. %C, the class name that's doing the logging. You might remember from our exercise, we did loggerfactory.getLogger, and then we provided it with a class name. That class name is what you see reflected in place of the %C in a format. %T is the thread that's doing the logging. This is really important because you might find that a log or an error is related to only one thread, and this will allow you to essentially sort the log file and only see the details from one specific thread so you can follow that thread without any clutter from other threads that are unrelated or not causing part of this problem. %M is the message that the user printed or stated in the log file. In other words, if a programmer says log.info and then foo would be the message. And then %N is the line break for the operating system that says, okay, let's go ahead and break to a new line. That will almost always be the last thing that you'll see on a logging format line, and it will almost always be the only thing that you see. You'll only see one of them in the logging file line. So let's go ahead and take a look in our virtual machine. Let's look at some examples. The logging configuration file is something that I consider to be like sourdough bread. In other words, you never just start with an empty document and start typing away. You'll typically start with a template log configuration file that you found from somewhere else. Now, of course, I'll be committing this all to GitHub, and you're more than welcome to use mine in your own application and tweak it as you wish. But nonetheless, here is just a sample log file, one that I found on the internet, and then I tweaked it for our needs, and we're going to continue to tweak it throughout this video. So we want to call it logback-spring, and we need to make sure it's on the class path because Spring is going to look for this file on the class path. So source main resources is a good place to start. So I'll simply say new, and then we can say other, and any old file will do because we're going to decide what this file is going to look like. So new file, file name, again, file name, syntax, spelling, very important because Spring is looking for this file. Logback-spring.xml, like so, and then finish. Let's go ahead and paste in the template that I see, and then we can correlate that back to the spreadsheet, or I'm sorry, the presentation that we saw earlier, and try and make some heads or tails out of it. So first of all, we start with an XML line, and then the root element for this document is called configuration. Now, property name logs, value equals logs, that indicates that we're going to have some directory called logs where all of our logs are going to live. The console appender, this is saying we're going to log these things to the console using this format. Take a look at the pattern that we have here. %D means start with a date, then give us a thread. So the thread is essentially a multi-threaded application. We'll have naturally multiple threads. Then -5 level is going to give us 5 characters of the logging level. Luckily, all of them are 5 or less, so info, error, warn, debug, so on and so forth. And then the logger that's producing this message, and then the message itself, and then the new line symbol. So that probably looks actually fairly familiar if you've looked at the console before and you've looked at any errors. Now, after that, we have a rolling file appender. Remember what rolling file means. That means we start with the log file with one name, and then when that fills up or when we cross a date or time boundary, we back up that file, we create a new one. Okay, now, pattern encoder, once again, we have some of the symbols that we saw earlier on our previous slides. So we know date And I will confess that %p is past me at the moment, but nonetheless, the class name, the thread, the message, and the new line. I know if you're watching this video, you're probably screaming and telling me what that %p is, but nonetheless, we'll see in just a moment. Now, the rolling policy, this is where we give it a file name, and take a look at the file name pattern. So first of all, we put it in the logs directory. Now, what's that? That's the variable that we declared up here, the property logs. So you see we declare a property with property name equals logs. But down here, we can refer to that property with $ curly, then the property name, and then close curly, and it will essentially substitute in /logs as the starting directory, then archived, then Spring Boot logger. And now take a look. Remember that %d? That says we're going to force a new log file year, month, day, so on any date boundary. So if we're logging something on October 18th, that's going to go to the October 18th log. The first log entry that happens on October 19th is going to create a new log file. And then the I indicator says once we hit the maximum file size, we will put a number on the log and create a new log file. What's the maximum file size? Here it is. It's 10. Okay. Now remember what a logger is. A logger is what aggregates logging information from our code and essentially puts it in an area where an appender can find it. So here is the definition of the root logger, and we're saying that we'll log everything at info level. Let's go ahead and change that to debug. Remember earlier we saw some debug statements that weren't getting logged. Now I'm saying let's go ahead and collect debug and greater. Now, log plant places at trace level. So what we're, and actually I probably should knock our root logger down to trace as well, because it wouldn't make sense to publish at trace if we're not even collecting at trace. So what we're saying here is we're going to log things, anything from a com.plantplaces package. We're going to log and we're going to subscribe these two appenders to it, both rolling file and console. Okay, now what are those? This is where it helps to kind of search within the file. Appender ref rolling file. You see that name? We scroll up, appender name rolling file. So what we're doing here is we are marrying together our logger, which is aggregating the log data, with an appender called rolling file. And here's our appender configuration right here. Additionally, we're saying that we just want to log things at the com plant places scope to that appender. We're also saying that we're going to log things to console. Now what's console? Here's our console appender up above, which is that interactive console that we see in Eclipse, but it also could be system.out or system.air. It could be any of the standard outputs that we'll see. Now remember that we're restricting this configuration to just com.plantplaces, but everything else will go to console. So console will show everything. Plant places we're specifically saying will just go to this rolling file appender that we see here. Okay, let's take a look and see how this works. So I'm going to go ahead and save and restart our application. Whoops. And let's confirm that we're able to see some logging information. I do want to go to, let's see, we'll go to source main, and I'm going to make a new folder. Okay, and next, and what are we going to call the folder? I believe we called it, if I go back, and I'll tell you what, I'll go back to Notepad, and we called this one logs lowercase. So let's go ahead and call it logs lowercase. So this is where our logs are going to live, and then we'll choose finish. Okay, I think we're looking good so far, so I'm going to stop the running application and restart it. In debug mode, we'll be fine. And go to our friend the console. There we go. Once again, you can take a look at this console, and you see a date, you see a thread, and then you see debug info and trace. You might notice that it's much more verbose than it used to be, because in a previous video we saw this was only showing info logs. Now it's all the way down to showing debugs and trace, and it's producing a lot of logging data. I'm really tempted to bump that back up a little bit, just because logging everything at trace is going to make this a very chatty log file. Nonetheless, let's go back and let's access our application. The chattier the log file, it's going to slow down our process a little bit, but even more importantly, it's going to just produce a lot of stuff we have to sift through. So we'll go to start, just like so, and maybe we'll go ahead and search for a bit of garbage. like we did before, and search. We know that's going to give us no results. We go back home. We can click around a little bit. Then eventually we can go back to Eclipse. And let's go ahead and do just a refresh on the project so it can take a look and look for any new files or folders that might have happened. Now, I made that logs directory up here, and it ends up I didn't need to because Spring was smart enough to make its own log file for me here. And you see we have spring boot logger log. Now take a look at the spring boot logger log, and let's remember where that came from. We got a logback-spring. Let me first of all tell you what. We'll expand so we can see this in high def. Spring boot logger, and this guy's getting a bit annoying, so we'll turn him off. There we go. Spring boot logger log. You see this here? And you see this here? That's the name of our rolling file appender, and we so far have only subscribed the rolling file appender to any log messages that are coming from a class in a com.plainplaces package. So let's take a look at our spring boot log, and what do we see? We see info, debug, info, info, debug, warn, debug, info. But notice that all of these, at least the ones down below here, are coming from the com.plainplaces domain. And we scroll to the right and we see that user has entered the start endpoint, entered search plants, received 0 results for our garbage search string, exiting search plants, and user has entered the start endpoint. So sure enough, we are very focused here, and we're looking at these log messages that we have generated from our own application. Now, one trick is we know we're doing a bit of mixing here. We have info, we have debug, we have warn, lots of different things, and we know that the debug and the infos, and actually the debugs and the trace really, can get really chatty. We might want a situation where we just see a subset of the logs, only those that are maybe warn and greater. Let's go ahead and modify our logback, and let's make a new appender that only shows those things that are really critical, so the warns and the graders. So to do this, I'm going to simply select, I'm going to select this appender. I'll just do a little bit of copy-paste. Copy, and paste. There we go. Now, a couple very important notes. First of all, it can't be the same log file, so let's call it spring boot severe, or let's call it spring boot, let's just call it severe logger. Oops. Severe logger. And then we also want to change the backup file name as well. We'll call this one severe logger. Sorry, my fingers are just one off. Severe logger. Everything else looks good, but I do need to add one more nugget, and that extra nugget is a filter, which, like I say, kind of like sourdough bread, it's something that I just prepared for us. So I copy this, and up here in my logging, right after the file name, I'll go ahead and drop that back in. So we'll say filter, threshold filter, warn. So what we're saying here is we want to log only warn and greater, which would be warn and error, into the special severe log file. If it were info, it would log info, warn, and error. If it were debug, it would log debug, info, warn, and error. So what we're saying is nothing less than warn, but everything more severe than warn. So go ahead and save. One more thing I'd like to do for good practice is, you see I've given two appenders the same name, which isn't really a good idea. So we'll call this one severe rolling file. We can give it whatever name we want. It's the class that determines that it's a rolling file appender. So let's call it severe rolling file, like so. And then, there we go. And then down at the bottom, we will essentially subscribe plant places to our severe rolling file appender. So appender ref, like so, Control C, and boom. And now we're saying, let's go ahead and subscribe the severe rolling file appender to our plant places configuration here. Makes it a little cleaner, a little bit nicer. Restart our application, and let's take a look at what we get. I'll tell you, it won't be too long before I turn off the trace and the debug in the console, just because you see it's really chatty now. So chatty that it's not of much use because there's so much debug info and trace. But nonetheless, let's go back and refresh our application, and we'll poke around a little bit. We'll search maybe for Eastern. I know we've done that, or just Easter's fine because that's part of Eastern. There we go. Search for a little bit of garbage. There we go. No results there. We'll go back to start. Okay, so that should have generated at least a warning message. I could potentially disconnect from the network and force an error because we know we have a try-catch block, and the catch block will log an error message. Either that, or I could manually force an error message somewhere else in code, which isn't a good idea unless we actually experience an error. Nonetheless, let's run back and let's refresh our directory here. And now you see we still have our Spring Boot logger that we have before, but look at this log. We have a new log, and look what's in here. Only the warn message received 0 results for our search string, which was a bunch of garbage. So the Spring Boot logger shows everything, but the severe logger, because we put the filter on it, is only showing warn or better, like so. So, a lot of things we can do with logs. We know we can log to an output stream. If you saw my previous video on networking, we know that a stream is a series of bytes, so we could theoretically log that across a network somewhere else. You could get an SMTP plugin, you could do emails, you could do text messages, things like that. Generally, you only want to do that for something that's really severe. But I really stress, as confusing as this file looks, as tricky as it looks, it's worth getting a good handle on it. Maybe watch this video a couple times, because in our field, being a good problem solver is more important than being a good programmer. Knowing how to look through code that somebody else wrote and diagnose what went wrong for a customer or a user of the system is one of the most important skills that you can have. So spend a little bit of time with this, take a look, play around, try these different subscription models and see what you get. So I hope this video has been helpful, and I look forward to seeing you in the next. Thank you.